Honestly, what is the world coming to? They let just about anyone serve drinks in here now. Look at her. No polish, no presence. Probably got the job because of some misplaced diversity initiative. The voice was a low, conspiratorial rasp, but carried the deliberate volume of a man who wanted to be overheard. It belonged to Commander Marcus Davies, an officer whose crisp, tailored uniform and aggressively shined shoes did little to conceal the soft, entitled core of a man who had climbed the ladder of bureaucracy, not bravery. He gestured with a subtle flick of his chin towards the young woman moving between the tables in the hallowed hall of the Naval Base Coronado Officers Club. The air inside was thick with the weight of history, a museum of quiet accomplishment where portraits of decorated admirals stared down with painted stoicism from mahogany-paneled walls. The scent of old leather, brine from the nearby Pacific, and expensive bourbon mingled, creating an atmosphere of exclusive, masculine power. The woman, Anna, was the antithesis of this environment. Her uniform was a simple, practical black blouse and slacks, impeccably clean but unremarkable. She wore no makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun, and her expression was one of neutral, detached efficiency. She moved with a liquid grace that was nearly invisible, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and answered requests with a quiet, of course, or right away. Her voice so soft it was almost a part of the ambient murmur of the room. She was a ghost at the feast, a functional object in a room full of self-important subjects. Davies watched her, a sneer playing on his lips. There's no respect for tradition anymore. This place used to have standards. His companion, a younger lieutenant, nodded nervously, his gaze flicking between the commander and the waitress, eager to agree but wary of being drawn into his superior's casual cruelty. The main event of the evening was a retirement dinner for a beloved Master Chief, but the true center of gravity was the head table, where Fleet Admiral Thomas Galloway sat. Galloway was a living legend, a man forged in the crucible of forgotten conflicts, his face a roadmap of hard-won wisdom. His presence commanded a reverence that silenced conversations as he passed. As Anna approached the head table to refill the Admiral's water, the sleeve of his dress white uniform shifted, revealing a tattoo on his weathered forearm. It was a simple, stark design, a single, downward-pointing trident, entwined by a sea serpent whose head was crowned with a single, faint star. The ink was faded, the lines blurred by decades of sun and sea, a permanent whisper of a past identity. Anna paused for a fraction of a second, her professional mask flickering with an unreadable emotion. Her eyes, which had been downcast and focused on her task, lifted and met the intricate design. She leaned forward slightly, her voice, just for the Admiral, a low, clear tone that barely disturbed the air. "Hello, sir," she said, her voice steady and respectful. "My mother has a tattoo just like yours." The statement was so unexpected, so strangely intimate in this formal setting, that it created a small pocket of silence around the head table. Admiral Galloway, who had been listening to a story from the officer beside him, turned his head slowly. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, settled on the young woman. He didn't speak, merely held her gaze, his expression a mixture of surprise and intense scrutiny. But the moment was shattered by Commander Davies, who had been watching the exchange from a nearby table with predatory interest. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his voice booming across the suddenly quiet room, dripping with sarcasm. "Did she now? Your mother?" He laughed, a short, barking sound that drew the attention of everyone. "Young lady, do you have any idea what you're looking at? You don't get a tattoo like that from a back-alley shop in Tijuana. That is not a piece of flash art. That symbol is a legacy. It represents a commitment and a level of service your little world couldn't possibly comprehend." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some offered weak, sycophantic chuckles in support of the commander. Others stared at their plates, wishing the floor would swallow them whole. It was a public dressing down, a brutal assertion of status, and Anna was its sole, defenseless target. The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly, a storm gathering in their depths, but he remained silent, observing. He watched the girl. He watched her reaction, and there was none. Anna did not flush with shame or anger. She did not stammer an apology or shrink away from the commander's verbal assault. Her face remained a placid mask of professional calm. She simply straightened up, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the Admiral, and said, "Understood, then." She turned and continued her rounds, her movements as fluid and silent as before, as if the commander's outburst had been nothing more than a clatter of dropped silverware, a minor disturbance to be ignored and forgotten. The silence she left in her wake was deafening. It was a silence filled with questions, with the raw, uncomfortable spectacle of a public shaming, and with the burgeoning, unsettling mystery of a quiet waitress who looked at the crest of a ghost unit and saw a memory of her mother. But for most in the room, the moment passed, filed away as an awkward but ultimately trivial incident. For Commander Davies, it was a satisfying reassertion of the natural order. For Admiral Galloway, however, it was something else entirely. It was a loose thread, a detail that didn't fit, and in his long and storied career, he had learned that the smallest, most insignificant-looking threads were often the ones that could unravel everything. He looked down at the tattoo on his arm, the serpent and the trident, and then his gaze followed the young woman as she moved silently through the room, a cipher hiding in plain sight. The world, he knew, was full of assumptions, and he had just witnessed a man make a very, very dangerous one. He had dismissed her not just as a waitress, but as someone incapable of understanding the world of sacrifice and honor he inhabited. He had drawn a line in the sand, separating his world of consequence from her world of service, and in doing so, had blinded himself to the possibility that those two worlds might not be separate at all. They might, in fact, be one and the same, and the quiet girl clearing plates might be more a part of his world than the loud, preening commander ever could be. The air in the club remained thick with unspoken tension. A fragile peace settled over the guests who now tried to resume their conversations with a forced, unnatural joviality. Commander Davies, puffed up with the self-satisfaction of a man who has won a battle no one else knew was being fought, held court at his table, his voice once again a confident baritone. He was dissecting the girl's audacity, reframing her simple statement as an act of insolence, a sign of the decaying standards of the modern world. He spoke of discipline, of knowing one's place, of the sacred lines between the officer class and the civilian staff who serve them. His words were a performance, an attempt to solidify his own status by diminishing hers, and his audience of junior officers provided the requisite nods and murmurs of agreement. They were caught in his orbit, their own careers tethered to his good opinion, and so they became silent accomplices to his arrogance. They laughed when he made a pointed joke. They shook their heads in feigned dismay at the supposed lack of decorum, all the while avoiding looking in Anna's direction, as if her very presence was now a source of collective embarrassment. Meanwhile, Anna continued her work, a study in focused, deliberate motion. Her hands were steady as she poured wine, her posture erect as she carried heavy trays of clear dishes back to the kitchen. There was no tremor of anger, no flicker of humiliation in her eyes. It was a display of control, so absolute it was unnerving. She moved through the currents of gossip and judgment like a ship in calm waters, unaffected by the storm raging on the surface. Her silence was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of immense, unshakable confidence. It was the calm of a professional who understood the mission, and the mission right now was to serve dinner. Everything else was noise. Everything else was irrelevant data, to be filtered out and discarded. This profound lack of reaction was, in itself, a powerful refutation of Davies' insults. He had tried to provoke a response, to force her into a position of weakness where he could dominate her, but she had given him nothing. She had denied him the satisfaction of her fear or her anger, and in doing so, had subtly seized control of the encounter. At the head table, Admiral Galloway watched her every move. He was a student of people, a skill honed over decades of command, of reading men in situations where a single misjudgment could mean the difference between life and death. He saw not a waitress, but an economy of motion that spoke of relentless training. He saw a situational awareness in the way her eyes constantly scanned the room, not with the idle curiosity of a bored server, but with the systematic sweep of a trained observer cataloging exits, threats, and assets. He saw the way she maintained her balance, her center of gravity low and stable, even when carrying a heavy, unbalanced load. These were not the habits of a civilian. These were the ingrained, unconscious markers of a life lived in a world of discipline and high stakes. He looked again at his tattoo, the symbol of Naval Special Warfare Development Group's most secretive and lethal element, a unit so clandestine its existence was only whispered about in the highest echelons of the intelligence community. The Trident Spectre Group, its members were ghosts, operators who moved through the shadows of global conflicts, their successes buried in classified after-action reports, their failures marked by anonymous stars on a memorial wall in a building that didn't officially exist. The tattoo was a relic from his younger days, a piece of a past he rarely spoke of. It was a bond, a sacred mark shared by a handful of men, and he had heard one legendary woman, a woman known only by her call sign, Orion, a founder of the unit, a master of tradecraft, a strategist whose brilliance was spoken of with the same reverence as the great generals of history. She had vanished from the official record years ago, presumed retired or dead, her legacy sealed away in top-secret files. The Admiral felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It was the thrill of discovery, the dawning realization that he was on the edge of something profound. He considered the possibilities. A coincidence? A daughter's fanciful story, conflating a common tattoo with a memory of her mother? Unlikely. The design was too specific. The single star above the serpents had a detail known only to those who had served in the unit during a specific, highly classified operation in the late 1990s. The commander's public humiliation of the girl was a gross miscalculation, an act of ignorant pride. Davy saw a menial worker and acted accordingly. Galloway saw a puzzle, a living anomaly, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who had trusted his instincts through 100 firefights, that the answer to that puzzle would fundamentally realign the social order of this room. The quiet competence of the waitress was a challenge to the loud arrogance of the commander, a silent argument that true worth was not measured in rank or volume, but in demonstrated ability. The stage was set, the players in their places. All that was needed was a crisis, a moment where the masks would be stripped away and the true nature of each person would be revealed under the unforgiving light of pressure. The universe, it seemed, was about to oblige. The first sign was subtle, a flicker in the grand chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling. The warm, golden light faltered for a heartbeat, dipping into a dim, amber twilight before surging back to full strength. Most guests barely noticed, attributing it to the quirks of an old building. Commander Davies was in the middle of a self-aggrandizing anecdote and didn't miss a beat. But Anna froze. For a single, imperceptible moment, her fluid motion ceased. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes flicking not towards the lights, but towards the main entrance and the small, discreet security panel on the wall beside it. Her posture shifted, her body coiling with a latent energy, like a predator sensing a change in the wind. The Admiral saw it. He saw the instantaneous transition from passive server to active observer. It was a reaction so deeply ingrained it was instinctual. He subtly pushed his chair back, giving himself room to move, his old combat senses tingling to life. Then it happened. A high-pitched, piercing alarm blared through the club, a sound designed to incite panic. It was immediately followed by the heavy, metallic clang of magnetic locks engaging. A series of thick, steel blast doors, normally hidden within the ornate wall panels, slid down with brutal finality, sealing the exits and windows, plunging the room into a state of emergency lockdown. The chandeliers went out completely, replaced by the stark, sterile red glow of emergency lighting. Panic erupted. The carefully constructed facade of military decorum shattered into 1,000 pieces. Officers, men trained for crisis, were reduced to a shouting, confused mob. Some yelled for information, others blindly pushed towards the now impassable exits, their polished shoes slipping on the smooth floor. The air filled with the sounds of fear, shouted questions, a few screams, the scrape of overturned chairs. Commander Davies, predictably, tried to assert control. "Everyone, remain calm," he bellowed, his voice straining to be heard over the alarm. "I am in command here. Security will have this sorted out in a moment. It's just a drill." But his words were hollow, his confidence a cheap veneer that was already cracking. He was posturing, not leading. He had no information, no plan, just a desperate need to be seen as the authority figure. He barked orders at a nearby lieutenant to get communications working, oblivious to the fact that all signals, cellular and radio, were dead, a standard protocol for a genuine security breach of this nature. The room was now a sealed box, a pressure cooker of escalating fear and uncertainty. Amidst the chaos, Anna moved with a serene and terrifying purpose. The noise, the shouting, the flashing red lights, it all seemed to fade away from her, her focus narrowing to a single point. She placed the silver tray she was holding onto a nearby table with a soft, deliberate click. Her hands, which had been serving wine moments before, were now her primary tools. She unbuttoned the cuffs of her simple black blouse and rolled them up her forearms with two precise, methodical folds, revealing toned, sinewy muscles. Her movements were no longer those of a waitress. They were the practiced, efficient motions of an operator. She ignored the panicked crowd, weaving through them not with haste, but with an unyielding, methodical pace, like a river flowing around stones. Her destination was a small, unassuming maintenance panel set into the mahogany wainscoting near the main bar, a panel that 99% of the people in this room had never even noticed. She knelt before it, her fingers probing the edges, searching for the hidden release. Commander Davies spotted her. "You, waitress, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Get away from there. That is restricted access naval equipment. That's an order." His voice was a mixture of fury and fear. He saw her actions as a final, unforgivable act of insubordination, a civilian meddling in matters far beyond her station. He started to move towards her, intent on physically removing her. But a calm, authoritative voice cut through the din, freezing him in his tracks. "Commander," Admiral Galloway said, his tone quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of absolute command. "Stand down," Davies stopped, his face a mask of confusion. "But, Admiral, I said, stand down," Galloway repeated, his gaze fixed on Anna. Let her work. The command was so final, so utterly certain, that Davies had no choice but to obey. He stood there, impotent and fuming, as the waitress he had so publicly mocked continued to defy his authority, now with the implicit sanction of the highest-ranking officer in the room. Anna found the seam in the panel, and with a practiced flick of her fingernail, popped it open. Inside was not a simple fuse box, but a complex web of fiber-optic cables and circuit boards, blinking with a dizzying array of diagnostic lights. It was the central nexus for the entire building's security and communications grid. To an untrained eye, it was an incomprehensible tangle. To Anna, it was a familiar landscape. Her hands moved with a surgeon's precision, her fingers dancing across the delicate components. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess. She pulled a single, hair-thin optical cable from its port, ignoring the cascade of red arrow lights that lit up in response. For the pocket of her slacks, she produced a small, innocuous object that looked like a simple keychain. It was a custom-built micro-shunt, a piece of sophisticated hardware no civilian would ever possess. She attached it to the cable, then plugged the other end into a diagnostic port that was clearly labeled for Tier 1 technicians. Only her eyes scanned the blinking lights, not with confusion, but with the rapid comprehension of a cryptographer reading code. She was diagnosing the lockdown, bypassing the central security mainframe and searching for the root cause of the failure. The entire sequence took less than 30 seconds. The collective gasp in the room was audible even over the dying wail of the alarm. The piercing siren sputtered and died, plunging the club into a profound, ringing silence. The harsh red emergency lights switched off, and for a moment, the room was in total darkness. Then, with a soft hum, the main chandeliers flickered back to life, casting their warm, golden glow over a scene of utter bewilderment. With a series of loud, pneumatic hisses, the massive steel blast doors retracted back into the walls, revealing the calm, starlit evening outside. The crisis was over. It had ended not with a SWAT team or a shouted negotiation, but with the quiet, precise, and utterly inexplicable actions of a young woman in a waitress uniform. Anna disconnected her micro shunt, reconnected the optical cable, and closed the panel, the click of the latch echoing in the stunned silence. She stood up, rolled her sleeves back down, and buttoned her cuffs. She picked up her silver tray and turned to face the room. Every eye was on her. The officers, the guests, Commander Davies, Admiral Galloway, they all stared, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Davies' face was a canvas of disbelief, his jaw slack, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces. He stammered, How did you? That's not possible." His world had been turned upside down. The rigid hierarchy he so fervently believed in, the clear lines between the important and the insignificant, had been erased by a woman he had dismissed as a nobody. He had shouted and postured and achieved nothing, while she had moved with silent competence and solved an impossible problem in seconds. The very foundation of his worldview was crumbling beneath his feet. He looked at her hands, the hands he had imagined were only good for carrying plates, and saw them not as the hands of a servant, but as the hands of a master craftsman, a virtuoso of a discipline he couldn't even name. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of 100 unanswered questions. The entire emotional landscape of the room had been redrawn. The fear and panic had been replaced by a deep, unsettling awe. The casual contempt for the waitress had transformed into a potent mixture of shock and dawning respect. Anna, for her part, seemed oblivious to the seismic shift she had caused. Her expression remained neutral, her posture relaxed. She had completed the task, and now she was ready for the next one. Her gaze swept the room, not in triumph, but in a simple, professional assessment. Were there any more immediate threats? Were there any injuries? Seeing none, her focus returned to her official duties. She walked toward the table where a guest had knocked over a water glass during the panic. With the same methodical grace she had used to disarm a Tier 1 security system, she picked up a linen napkin and began to quietly clean up the spill. It was this act, more than any other, that broke the spell. The sheer, unadulterated professionalism of it was so incongruous with the high drama of the preceding minutes that it bordered on the surreal. She had just performed a feat of technical wizardry that would have stumped a team of elite naval engineers, and now she was wiping up spilled water. The contrast was a powerful statement. For her, these two acts were perhaps not so different. They were both just problems that required a calm, methodical solution. The spectacle of her quiet competence was a louder condemnation of Commander Davies' arrogance than any shouted retort could ever have been. His bluster had been proven to be nothing but empty noise, while her silence was revealed to be the shield of profound, hidden depth. The room was her audience, and she had just given a masterclass in the triumph of action over words. And the final act of validation was about to begin. Admiral Galloway rose from his seat at the head table. The scrape of his chair against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. He moved with a purpose that commanded the attention of every person present. His steps were measured, his back ramrod straight, his eyes fixed on one person and one person only, Anna. He didn't walk around the tables. He walked through them, a path clearing before him as officers and their spouses scrambled to get out of his way. He was a ship of the line, cutting through a fleet of lesser vessels, his presence an undeniable force of nature. He stopped directly in front of her, standing between her and the table she was cleaning. She slowly straightened up, her own gaze finally rising to meet his. The room held its breath. This was the moment of judgment, the official verdict on the impossible events that had just transpired. Commander Davies watched, his face pale, a cold dread seeping into his veins. He had publicly humiliated this woman in front of a living legend, and that legend was now giving her his undivided attention. The Admiral's face was unreadable, carved from granite. He looked at the young woman, at the quiet strength in her eyes, at the steady hands that were still holding a damp napkin. He saw not a waitress, but a legacy. He saw the echo of a ghost he had served with decades ago, a woman whose skill and courage had been the stuff of whispered legends in the intelligence community. He was connecting the dots, the tattoo, the impossible skill, the unshakable calm under pressure. The puzzle was solving itself. He didn't need to see a file. He didn't need a security clearance confirmation. He knew. He looked down at his own forearm, at the faded serpent and trident, and then back at her. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it resonated with an authority that filled every corner of the room. The lockdown protocol for this facility is a closed-loop, triple-redundant system designed by a DARPA contractor known as Project Chimera. He stated, his words clear and precise, a lecture being delivered to an audience of one and everyone. It's designed to be unbreakable from the inside. It has no wireless overrides. It's hardened against electromagnetic pulses. To bypass it, you would need to physically access the primary control nexus and manually input a de-escalation code. A code that changes every 12 hours and is known only to myself, the base commander, and the on-duty watch officer in the Naval Cyber Command Center in Quantico. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He was methodically explaining the sheer impossibility of what she had just done. Or, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, you could use a failsafe, a hard-coded backdoor built into the system's core programming by its original designer. A backdoor accessible only with a specific piece of proprietary hardware and a deep, intrinsic knowledge of the system's architecture. A backdoor known by its creator's call sign. He held her gaze, his blue eyes boring into hers. He asked the question that would change everything. Was your mother's call sign Orion? The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the chandeliers seemed like a roar. Commander Davies' breath hitched in his throat. The name Orion meant nothing to him, but the Admiral's tone, the sheer reverence with which he spoke it, told him it was a name of immense significance. Anna's composure finally broke, but only for a second. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, not surprise, but a kind of sad, resigned recognition. The time for hiding was over. She gave a single, slow nod. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet everyone heard it. She was Orion, sir. The confirmation hung in the air, electric and transformative. The Admiral's shoulders, which had been tense, relaxed. A slow, sad smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a man meeting the child of a fallen comrade, a ghost from a cherished past. He looked from Anna to the stunned faces of the officers around him, his gaze finally landing on the mortified Commander Davies. "Commander," he said, his voice now laced with cold, hard steel. "For your education, Orion was the lead architect of not only Project Chimera, but nearly every sensitive security and infiltration protocol this Navy has used for the past 30 years. She was a legend in naval intelligence and special warfare. A founding member of a unit you don't have the clearance to know exists. She saved more lives with her mind than most soldiers do with a rifle. She was a genius and a patriot of the highest possible caliber." He let the words hang, a public indictment of Davies' ignorance. Then he turned back to Anna. He looked at her simple black uniform, at her steady hands, at the quiet dignity that radiated from her. He saw not the daughter of a legend, but the living embodiment of that legend's ethos. In a room full of men wearing medals they had been awarded, she stood as a monument to achievements that would never be officially recognized. He stood up to his full height, his posture shifting from that of a dinner guest to that of a fleet admiral on the deck of his flagship. And then he did something that no one in that room had ever seen him do before, something so contrary to protocol, so profound in its implication, that it sent a shockwave through the assembled officers. Fleet Admiral Thomas Galloway, a man who had met presidents and kings, a man who commanded the most powerful naval force on the planet, raised his hand to his brow and rendered a slow, perfect, formal salute. He saluted the waitress. It was not a gesture of condescension or irony. It was a mark of the deepest and most profound respect. A four-star admiral saluting a civilian food server. He was not saluting her. He was saluting the legacy she represented. He was saluting Orion. He was saluting the quiet, unseen, unthanked competence that was the true bedrock of the United States military. He was saluting the daughter who so clearly carried her mother's fire. The act was a thunderclap of vindication. It was the final, irrefutable validation of Anna's worth and the ultimate, crushing repudiation of Commander Davies' prejudice. The sound of the Admiral's hand crisply striking his brow echoed the finality of a judge's gavel. The case was closed. The verdict was in. In that single, silent gesture, the entire social hierarchy of the room was not just inverted, it was obliterated. Rank, uniform, and station had been rendered meaningless, replaced by a more fundamental measure of a person's value, their character and their competence. Commander Davies stood frozen, his face ashen. The salute was a physical blow, a public and undeniable declaration of his catastrophic error in judgment. He had mocked the daughter of a hero, and a fleet admiral had just honored her in front of all his peers. His career might not be over, but his reputation was in ashes. He had shown himself to be not a leader, but a petty, ignorant bully. The other officers in the room, those who had laughed at his jokes and been complicit in their silence, now looked at the floor, their faces burning with a shared, collective shame. They had all been judged and found wanting. They had all failed a fundamental test of leadership, the ability to see worth where it is not obviously displayed. Anna, for the first time, looked truly uncomfortable. The salute, this public display of reverence, was something she clearly did not want. Her ethos, her mother's ethos, was one of anonymity, of quiet service in the shadows. To be thrust into the spotlight like this was a violation of that code. But she understood the gesture's importance. She held the Admiral's gaze and gave a small, respectful dip of her head, the civilian equivalent of returning the salute. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a moment of shared understanding between two people who belonged to a world that no one else in that room could ever truly comprehend. The Admiral held the salute for a long moment before crisply dropping his hand. He then turned to Master Chief, whose retirement dinner this was supposed to be. "Master Chief," he said, his voice once again calm and steady, "I believe we owe this young lady, and the memory of her mother, a profound debt of gratitude. And I believe we owe her an apology." The message was clear. It was directed at everyone. The silence that followed was not awkward, but contemplative. It was the silence of a lesson being learned, a hard, painful, and necessary lesson about the danger of assumptions and the true meaning of respect. The story of that night spread through the base like wildfire, carried on the currents of gossip from the officers' club to the enlisted barracks, from the flight line to the chow hall. It was a story that had all the elements of a modern legend: a humble, underestimated hero, a pompous villain, a moment of crisis, and a dramatic, public vindication by a revered leader. The details were embellished with each telling. The waitress, Anna, became Orion's daughter, a mysterious figure of incredible skill. Some versions claim she had single-handedly fought off a team of intruders. Others whispered she was an active-duty ghost operative, working undercover for a reason no one could fathom. The technical details of what she did to the security system were lost, replaced by the simpler, more powerful image of her calming the storm with a quiet touch. The narrative was irresistible. It was a story about justice, about the quiet professional triumphing over the loud-mouthed bureaucrat. It resonated deeply within the military culture, which, despite its rigid hierarchy, has a deep and abiding respect for demonstrated competence. The story became a parable, a teaching tool passed from seasoned veterans to new recruits. It was a reminder that the person serving you your food, the janitor cleaning the floors, the civilian contractor fixing the air conditioner, any one of them might have a history, a skill set, a depth of character you couldn't possibly guess from their uniform. It was a lesson in humility, a warning against the arrogance of assumption. Commander Davies became the story's cautionary tale. He was not officially reprimanded. Admiral Galloway was too wise for that. A formal punishment would have made Davies a martyr in the eyes of some. Instead, the Admiral allowed the subtle, relentless pressure of social correction to do its work. Davies was not shunned, but he was treated differently. His peers looked at him with a new, critical eye. The easy deference he had once commanded from his junior officers was replaced by a more reserved, formal respect. They had seen his true character, and it was found lacking. The humiliation of that night followed him like a shadow. To his credit, Commander Davies learned the lesson. A week after the incident, he sought Anna out. He found her not in the officers' club, but during her other job, shelving books at the base library, a detail that only added another layer of quiet humility to her growing legend. He approached her not with the swagger of a commander, but with the posture of a penitent. He offered a full, unreserved apology. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to explain his behavior. He simply admitted that he had been wrong, that his prejudice and arrogance had blinded him, and that he was deeply sorry for the disrespect he had shown her and the memory of her mother. Anna listened patiently, her expression as neutral as ever. When he was finished, she simply said, "Thank you, Commander. I accept your apology." There was no gloating, no "I told you so." She granted him grace, a final, quiet lesson in character. The encounter changed Davies. He became a quieter, more thoughtful officer, one who listened more than he spoke, one who made an effort to know the names and stories of the enlisted sailors and civilian staff who worked for him. The arrogant gatekeeper had been humbled, and in that humbling, had found the beginnings of true wisdom. As for Anna, she remained a mystery. She deflected all questions about her mother and her own skills with a polite but firm, "I'd rather not talk about it." She continued to work her shifts at the club and the library, her demeanor unchanged. The sudden fame was an unwelcome complication, but she weathered it with the same stoicism she had shown during the crisis. The Admiral had offered her a position as a civilian consultant, a high-paying job with his personal strategic team, but she had politely declined. "Thank you, sir," she had said, "but I'm where I need to be." Her purpose, it seemed, was not to chase glory or recognition, but to live a quiet life, honoring her mother's legacy not by replicating her career, but by embodying her principles: silence, competence, and service, no matter how humble the role. A small, unofficial tradition began at the officers' club. The maintenance panel she had opened was never painted over. Someone had affixed a small, brass plaque beneath it, engraved with a single word, Orion. It was a subtle tribute, a nod to the secret history that now permeated the building's walls. The story became part of the institutional memory of the base, a permanent fixture in its culture. It was a living reminder that heroes are not always the ones in the spotlight. Sometimes they are the quiet ones in the background, the ones you underestimate, the ones who prove their worth not with words, but with unshakable, undeniable competence. The legacy of that evening was not one of crisis, but of clarity. It was a moment that stripped away the superficial trappings of rank and status and revealed a more fundamental truth. It was a story that would be told and retold for years, a modern myth about a waitress, a commander, and an admiral, and the night a quiet truth silenced a world of noise. The ripples of that single evening continued to spread, creating a lasting and profound impact on the culture of Naval Base Coronado. Weeks turned into months, and the story of Orion's daughter solidified from fresh gossip into established folklore, a foundational myth for a new generation of sailors and officers. The tale became a mandatory part of the orientation for all newly assigned personnel at the base. It was told not by a polished public affairs officer, but by a grizzled command master chief, a man whose weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of practical, hard-won experience. He would gather the new arrivals in a sterile classroom and tell them the story, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He wouldn't focus on the technical details of the lockdown, but on the human element. He would paint a vivid picture of Commander Davies' arrogance, making the young ensigns and seamen squirm in their seats with secondhand embarrassment. Then he would describe Anna's calm, her quiet competence, her utter refusal to be drawn into the commander's drama. She never raised her voice, the Master Chief would say, his eyes scanning the faces of the young leaders before him. She never complained. She never explained. She simply did the job. She solved the problem. While a man with eagles on his collar was shouting, a woman with a serving tray was leading. Let that sink in. The story's moral was always the same. Respect is a verb. It's not about saluting the uniform. It's about recognizing the worth of the individual wearing it or not wearing it. It's about understanding that the most valuable members of any team are often the ones who seek no credit, the quiet professionals who simply get the job done. Admiral Galloway, in the final months before his own retirement, incorporated the incident into his speeches at the Naval War College and the Academy. He used it as a case study in modern leadership, a perfect example of the dangers of cognitive bias and the power of humility. We train our officers to assess threats on the battlefield, he would tell the assembled midshipmen and flag officers. But we often fail to train them to assess talent in their own ranks, especially when that talent doesn't look or sound the way they expect. The greatest threat to our readiness is not the enemy's technology. It is our own arrogance. It's the assumption that we know who is and who is not valuable. The commander saw a Waitress. He should have seen a strategic asset. His failure of perception was more dangerous than any system malfunction. The legend of Anna herself grew, but she remained firmly on its periphery. She eventually left her jobs at the base, seeking an even quieter life away from the unwelcome notoriety. She disappeared as silently as she had once moved through the officers' club, leaving behind only the story. But her actions had created a permanent, positive change. The relationship between the civilian staff and the uniformed personnel on the base subtly improved. There was a new current of mutual respect, a shared understanding fostered by the memory of that night. Officers made a point to learn the names of the cooks and custodians. Enlisted sailors offered help to the groundskeepers. It was a small, incremental shift, but a meaningful one. The Orion panel, as it came to be known, became a point of interest on the base. Visiting dignitaries were sometimes shown the small brass plaque, and the story would be told again, reinforcing its central lesson. It served as a physical monument to a non-physical ideal, that true strength lies not in dominance, but in service, that true authority is not granted by rank, but earned through competence, and that the most powerful voice can sometimes be silence itself. Years later, a new commander was assigned to the base, a young, ambitious officer fresh from a staff tour in the Pentagon. During his first week, he was having dinner at the officers' club when a minor electrical issue caused the lights to flicker. He immediately and loudly began to berate the club's manager, his voice echoing with the same entitled arrogance that Marcus Davies had once displayed. An older captain sitting at a nearby table watched for a moment, then calmly walked over. He didn't challenge the new commander's authority. He simply tapped him on the shoulder and gestured towards the wall. "Commander," he said, his voice low and even, "before you continue, you should probably hear the story about that little brass plaque over there. The legacy of Anna's quiet competence had become a self-correcting mechanism within the base's culture, a silent guardian against the very arrogance that had set the whole story in motion. True legacy isn't a statue or a building named after you. It's a principle, an idea that continues to live and breathe and shape the behavior of others long after you are gone. It's a standard that people strive to live up to. Anna, the quiet waitress, and her mother, the ghost operator Orion, had left behind more than just a good story. They had left behind a better way of seeing the world, a blueprint for a culture of respect. They had proven, in one unforgettable night, that a person's value is etched in their actions, not their title, and that the most profound strength is the one that doesn't need to announce itself. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance and where silent professionalism defines their worth. Subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.